Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have heard by now. We talked about it here on the channel in my previous video. Claressa Shields and Savannah Marshall will both be fighting on Boxer shows on Sky Sports in the UK. Boxer reached an agreement with Salida Promotions to bring Shields to the UK. Daniel Dubois' sister, Caroline Dubois, has also signed to turn pro with Boxer on Sky. And, here we're going to focus on Shields.
She's a Sky Sports fighter now.
It appears that for all intents and purposes, she is going to be taking her talents across the pond and boxing out of the United Kingdom on Sky. This effectively bridges the gap so that both her and Savannah can get paid the way they want to get paid and make the fight, because now they're boxing on the same platform. It was different before.
This completely changes the dynamic of everything.
Shields versus Marshall has now become an in-house fight, and in-house fights are easier to make than cross-promotional, cross-network fights.
It's not as much of a hassle.
Shields ain't over there on Showtime, and Savannah's not over there on Matchroom and DAZN. No, they're both boxing under the same banner on the same platform now, and in that way, it does make the fight easier to make so long as both sides want it.
This bridges the gap between them
and affords Adam Smith and the people over there at Sky the opportunity to show Eddie Hearn up. You heard that right. This affords them the opportunity to make a fight that people thought he was going to deliver, but didn't.
Listen, it was different before.
A level-headed guy like me understands that the way that the situation was in the past isn't the way that the situation is here today. Claressa Shields wanted something like 750 G's to do the fight, and for Eddie Hearn, a number like that at that time, it just didn't make sense.
That's close to $1 million.
Claressa Shields wanted to be paid well in excess of her market value at that time. For Eddie Hearn, it makes no business sense giving her that kind of money for that fight, even for that fight.
He's not her promoter.
It wasn't Eddie Hearn's job to finance Claressa Shields' retirement plan. Giving her a number like that, a number that at that time was well in excess of her market value. He's not her promoter.
It wasn't.
But this situation is different because Sky Sports is invested in Claressa Shields in all the ways that Eddie Hearn was not. She's going to be boxing on Sky. So her market value and raising it.
Raising the profile of the fight.
I reiterate, Eddie Hearn and Matchroom, they weren't in the business of promoting Claressa Shields. Whereas Sky, Boxer, they are.
So it's very much a different dynamic.
The extent of Eddie Hearn's interest in Claressa Shields was likely limited to a single fight, a singular event, the Savannah Marshall fight. But beyond that, he wasn't in the business of promoting Claressa Shields. The relationship between Claressa, Sky Sports, and Boxer, it's different because she's going to be fighting on that platform, and it appears that their engagement isn't even limited to the Savannah Marshall fight. It looks a lot like Claressa's going to have maybe 1 or 2 fights.
Sky and Boxer are in the business of promoting.
I think they're going to try and promote Claressa in order to promote the fight and raise its profile. Given Claressa Shields' characteristic outbursts, the way she carries herself, I don't know how many fans she's going to win over there in the United Kingdom so long as that keeps up. But what I do know is that she's the kind of fighter you love to hate. And I've spoken to many a Brit, told me they want nothing more than to see Savannah Marshall knock her out.
They want to see Savannah shut her up.
And with both fighters now fighting on the same platform, under the same banner, it makes that fight that much more feasible. And it allows that platform to grow the profile of the fight properly by giving both Savannah and Claressa opportunities to get out there in front of that paying public, to garner those eyes, garner those ears, garner that attention, to raise that fight's profile and raise its marquee value so that Claressa can get paid the way she wants to get paid.
Savannah, too.
And what better way for Sky to stick it to Eddie Hearn than to do the fight that he failed to do? You think there's not hard feelings and big egos there? If Sky Sports can make this fight happen, and it's looking a lot like they can, they end up delivering a big fight for the sport of women's boxing, yeah, but they also make Eddie Hearn look bad for having not delivered it in the process. The way it's looking, this might leave Eddie Hearn so inclined to redeem himself by delivering a big fight of his own. Perhaps Taylor versus Serrano. I mean, we're seeing that there are conversations happening. The silver lining in all of this is that a competitive market is a healthy market. There are that many more avenues of opportunity for women boxers in the United Kingdom since Sky Sports is carving out their own lane with their own stable of fighters, and this is only the beginning.
This is just a starting roster.
Still got a lot of homegrown talent there that needs major backing, needs major promotion. Fighters like Stevie Levy, who was in action very recently. Fighters like Rhiannon Dixon, who we've had the good pleasure of speaking to here on the channel. She's going to be in action on September the 12th.
Carly Skelly, Lisa Whiteside.
The list goes on. Any stable is thereby made better for adding any one of those fighters to it. So things are set to become very competitive, and I wouldn't be at all surprised to see either Matchroom or Boxer make those additions to their own stable to keep up with the Joneses.
Sky's gone as far as signing Clarissa.
It is a major move, a major signing, and a power play.
It denotes commitment.
It denotes an earnest effort to do whatever is necessary in order to deliver big fights. And who it is that Clarissa Shields is going to be fighting on Sky, your guess is as good as mine. At this point, I wouldn't be at all surprised to hear that Sky maybe invests in the career of Raquel Miller.
Yet another one of Clarissa Shields' rivals.
I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Raquel fighting either Clarissa Shields or Savannah Marshall on Sky in the build-up of what is to be their showdown. It wouldn't surprise me at all because they're going to have to find somebody for those girls to fight. And Raquel's better than some of the girls they already have fought.
Boxing is the theater of the unexpected.
And I really wasn't expecting that Sky would actually sign Clarissa Shields. I mean, Savannah Marshall, a few others I knew about. I knew they'd be migrating over there. But signing Clarissa, that really caught me by surprise. That really caught me off guard. And these are very exciting times.
For the sport of women's boxing, it is.
Because we are that much closer to Shields versus Marshall. We are, in fact, closer to that fight now than we ever were before.
Yeah, thanks to the Brits.
In other news, I'm sure most of you have heard by now, by way of the WBO, that the purse bid for the mandatory bout between WBO welterweight champion Terence Crawford and challenger Sean Porter has been moved to September 14th, following a request from the promoters of both fighters, Top Rank for Crawford and Tom Brown's TGB Promotions for Sean Porter.
It's a little over 2 weeks.
Both companies requested additional time to continue ongoing negotiations. The purse bid was originally scheduled for Thursday, September 2nd at 9 a.m. Eastern Time at the WBO main offices in San Juan, Puerto Rico. And, it says a lot about the American boxing scene that the most exciting news coming from it is in reference to a delayed purse bid. I mean, don't get me wrong. This is actually encouraging news towards seeing the fight get done, because essentially what this means is that both sides are talking. Both sides are negotiating, trying to reach agreeable terms for the fight. The fact that they're both requesting that the purse bid be postponed, that the purse bid be delayed, they're both requesting an extension.
So it is encouraging.
But I reiterate, it says a lot about the dismal, abysmal American boxing scene that the most exciting news coming out of it is in reference to a postponed purse bid for a fight that we've been talking about for well over a year.
Feels like years, honestly.
Delivering highly anticipated bouts in the American boxing scene seldom ever happens in a timely fashion.
It's only coming now after all other resources have been exhausted.
It's only coming now after the WBO painted both guys into a corner to where it's either fight or flight.
Yeah, it's good news.
Great, these guys are actually having a dialogue. They're actually negotiating, and that only took 1,000,000 fucking years, right?
Right.
Ever since this news broke, I've wondered what's Top Rank's commitment to Terence Crawford moving forward, because they really have been unable to get him high-profile fights in the welterweight division the last, 2, maybe 3 years? And his next fight is set to be his last fight under contract, under the Top Rank promotional banner. In a situation like that, Top Rank might decide to cut their losses and just, let Terence Crawford go his own way, do his own thing.
I've been wondering how committed they are to Terence Crawford.
And how committed they are to delivering this fight. Manny Pacquiao just lost to Yordanis Ugas. Errol Spence Jr. could be out of commission 6 months to a year. How much of an incentive was it for Top Rank to continue being in the Terence Crawford business? Based on this news, it appears they still are, because they're still negotiating with TGB and they still want to get this fight over the line. They still want to do this thing.
So I guess they're still in the Terence Crawford business for now.
And maybe, just maybe, if they can get this fight over the line and by some chance Terence Crawford makes it past Sean Porter, maybe Top Rank will still be in the Terence Crawford business, not necessarily so they can do a Spence fight, maybe not in reference to that fight, but maybe so that they can do a fight between Terence Crawford and Josh Taylor.
Our goal is to be partnered approach and bring over some of the biggest names. If it's Inoue, Lomachenko, if it's Josh Taylor fighting at home like he will be doing in December, if it's Michael Conlan, whatever the huge asset list and the fighters that we have, from Shakur Stevenson to Terence Crawford, we know that the UK fans are as robust and excited as anybody all over the world. And these kids, they all relate. They relate to the sport of fighting, and they relate to great action and great events.
That is the voice of Todd Dubow, of Top Rank president, chip off the old block, Bob Arum's son-in-law. And he's talking about, Top Rank's relationship with Sky Sports, Top Rank's talent, relation to Sky Sports moving forward, and how some of those fighters, Terence Crawford among them, might fight in the United Kingdom.
And who would Terence Crawford fight there?
Take a wild fucking guess. Josh Taylor, who's going to be fighting there very soon in defense of all his world titles at 140 pounds against Jack Catterall. Beyond that, Josh is singing the same tune. He's talking about moving up to welterweight and becoming a 2-division champion. It's not likely he gets an opportunity like that from Yordenis Ugas or Errol Spence Jr., but his stablemate, Terence Crawford...
Oh, you're cooking with rice.
A fight like that doesn't have to happen in the United States. And... ESPN doesn't necessarily have to foot the bill, the entire bill for it. If the fight happens across the pond in the United Kingdom, Sky Sports might foot the bill for the fight. And because Sky Sports isn't in bed with Matchroom anymore, their budget opens up to invest in other fights involving other fighters that perhaps don't come with as hefty a price tag as and Anthony Joshua would, for example.
They could use the content.
The opportunity to deliver big fights for their remaining subscribers that subscribe to Sky because, they want to see a boxing match every so often.
The ones that do.
So maybe, just maybe, Top Rank stays in the Terence Crawford business beyond a Sean Porter fight because they can still do a fight like this over there across the pond in the United Kingdom. And you know what? They can let Sky Sports foot the bill for the goddamn thing.
Because it's not all on ESPN anymore.
In heavyweight news by way of a post from Boxing Social, a rematch between Joseph Parker and Derek Chisora is looking increasingly unlikely this year, with Parker's manager David Higgins saying the time is running out to agree for a suitable fight date. They very recently entertained the possibility of taking on none other than Smokin' Joe Joyce. Parker's manager David Higgins wants his boxer to face the very best that are out there. I think it's a good time to be ranked number 3 with the WBO. The key is to keep busy and keep winning. After a relatively uncertain period in the division, if you're up there, then the next year or two could be quite good, Higgins told Sky Sports. Places could shuffle around and a world title fight might come up for those that are there at the right time. Yes, we would fight Joe Joyce, Higgins said. Joyce will be ringside to watch Joshua versus Usyk, but his manager indicates that nobody's willing to fight his man. Nobody will be excited to fight Joe, but unfortunately for them, he's ranked number 1, so somebody will have to fight him, Joyce's manager, Sam Jones, told Sky Sports. Joseph Parker is a great fight. If it presents itself, we take it in a heartbeat. Andy Ruiz Jr., Luis Ortiz, it's a real possibility it could happen. Joe is game for either of those. We're looking forward to making big fights now for Joe. I've made it clear that we only want big fights, and that's what we'll get. Very recently, news broke that Joe Joyce signed an extension with Old Fish Eyes Frank Warren. He's going to be boxing there with Frank for the foreseeable future, and because of that, I don't actually know how likely a Joseph Parker fight is. Don't get me wrong. It's the right time for Joe Joyce to take on a former world champion who still has some good years left, the way that Joe still has some good years left. Because Joe, he's actually a pretty young guy.
He's 6 years younger than Joe Joyce.
He's already been in there with Andy Ruiz and Carlos Takam, Anthony Joshua, Dillian Veit, Derek Chisora.
Junior Fa.
He's already been a world champion. And Joseph Parker, he's only 29 years old, yet he has a very robust resume, a very robust body of work. The Joe Joyce, who's 35 years old, and he's not getting any younger. Time is of the essence. That's exactly the kind of fight that Joe Joyce needs, but I'm not sure that fight happens because, well, look, David Higgins is likely only as open to that fight as Frank Warren's wallet is open to paying for it.
How much money would it take to get Joe over there?
Don't get me wrong, I like the idea of Joe Joyce versus Joe Parker, but I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for that one to come off. Finally, per tweet from Michael Benson, Caleb Plant on Canelo Alvarez. He's looked beatable in a lot of his bigger fights. He looked beatable versus Lara. He got schooled by Floyd. He lost the first fight to Triple G, and it was really close the second time. They're not going to convince me the guy's unbeatable. And, you can't blame Caleb Plant for
talking like this.
Looking at Canelo Alvarez as being beatable because that's the task that's in front of him. He has to try to beat him. He has to be of that mindset that Canelo Alvarez isn't invincible. And no fighter is really. But, the parallels that Caleb is making, the Lara fight, the Mayweather fight, the Golovkin fight.
What, you're supposed to be the Lara?
The Golovkin in the situation, the Mayweather in the situation. Is that the parallel that you're trying to make? Because if that's the parallel that you're trying to make, well, you are not to your division.
What those fighters were to their divisions.
At the time that those fighters fought Canelo Alvarez. And, those fights, the Mayweather fight, the Lara fight, hell, even the Golovkin fight, those fights were years ago. You understand that, right? And you understand that Canelo Alvarez might very well be a better fighter here today than he was yesterday when he had those fights, because he has those experiences to draw from now.
From having had those kinds of fights.
But how many of those kinds of fights has Caleb Plant had? His entire career. How many?
How many experiences like that does he have to draw from?
Well, I don't expect Caleb Plant to ask himself that question. I don't expect Caleb Plant to make light of that while he's trying to sell Canelo Alvarez short as a fighter. But yeah, Canelo Alvarez might have looked human against those guys, but those guys are better guys than any of the guys that you've fought. And if you were fighting those kinds of guys the way that he's been fighting those kinds of guys, not only would you look human, you'd likely falter in those situations. And never even mind those guys, because some of the other guys that he's fought, like Callum Smith, like Billy Joe Saunders, like Daniel Jacobs, those would be career best wins for a guy like Caleb Plant, because that's how thin his resume is.
While we're on the subject.
And no, I'm not expecting Caleb Plant to make light of any of this stuff. I'm not expecting him to sell himself short. I'm just saying the fundamental flaw in his logic is that no matter how human Canelo Alvarez looked against those fighters, Caleb Plant himself has never fought anyone like those fighters.
I mean, who's the best guy he fought? Jose Uzcategui?
This will be the very first time that Caleb Plant has fought a top-tier, top-shelf talent like a Canelo Alvarez, but for Canelo, it won't be the first time that he's fought someone the likes of a Caleb Plant. He's seen those kinds of fighters before. He's seen them in Callum Smith. He's seen them more recently in Billy Joe Saunders in the last 12 months. So, I mean, really, Caleb Plant...
Say what he wants.
Think whatever he wants. It's a free country. But that's the fundamental flaw in his logic. That, yeah, Canelo looked human against those guys, but guess what? You ain't those guys.